methods to make your site models. The first method is just bringing in the lines from however you have them in CAD, from GIS, whatever it is, but using the contour lines and creating a surface from those contour lines. So everyone needs to first obviously import their CAD drawing into the file or into Rhino. I've already taken Jeff's file from CAD. So he's manipulated all of these lines and actually put them at their correct elevations in 3 dimensions, which is quite simple, just taking each of these lines and moving them up by whichever increment you have them. So if you do that first, and then once you have the file set up that way, it's quite easy to make this terrain. So starting from, he's actually broken his down, and each line is on its own elevation. You don't have to do this. All you really need is just every contour line, and just make sure that they're separated properly. So if I go and actually select all of these so select all of those contours, and then he has some that are missing as well. So we'll just grab each of these. And then what we're going to do is extract the points from these lines. So just by typing in the command extract points, it will then bring all of the points out for you, and then we can move them to a new layer, which I've labeled points. And this might freeze, so just give it a second.
What does that command do?
So it's taking all of the, basically all of the control points on each of your curves. It just takes those points and then extracts them so they're not technically associated with the line. You could do it both ways and just turn on the control points and use those control points for the next command. But I just find it easier to actually extract those points and then put them on a new layer so that we can separate the geometries when we're making them. Okay, so select.
What does the patching do?
So patch is the command that's going to create this big surface, which is our landscape. So we're just essentially bridging between all of these points. Now this is kind of what takes a little bit of fine tuning depending on what your contours are like in your landscape. You're gonna mainly just change the U and V spans and the stiffness. So the stiffness is obviously gonna create more of a defined edge as you bring the value up and down, and then the surface U and V spans, those are just changing the variables between basically the slopes of the curves. So I usually use something like this. Okay, actually that's why. So in order to see it, if we just show the ghosted view, now we can see that terrain that it's built. Now this model that we're working with is a pretty large scale model, so you can't necessarily see the change in the terrain. So I'm just going to move this over so that we can work on this. So this is what has been generated from all of these points. Now in order to kind of double check and see what see how that terrain has brought it out, because if, Jeff's group, they created their model from, it was 1 meter contours, or 1 meter contours, and when that was actually built in a model, the contours were far too spaced out. So they went back in the model, and now they're trying to just create smaller contours, so 1/2 meter contours. So the easiest way then, if you just type in the contour command, and you want to just show that the contours are going from top to bottom, so just create a line on one of the right or front panels. And you can change the distance between the contours, so we want 1/2 meter. And it's just going to generate, but we can now see the increased detail in all of the contour lines that's created on that new terrain. So those are, I guess, this new terrain or these new contours that have been brought out. These are some of the curves that we can then use to bring into Illustrator. That's going to be for tomorrow when we make these Illustrator files. But just for today, we're going over how to actually construct this 3-dimensional model of your terrain. Yeah, Mallory?
Will you changing the distance between the contours make it inaccurate?
Sorry, say that again?
Like if you're changing the distance between the contour lines, like doesn't that change the landscape and make it inaccurate?
I mean, obviously there's going to be some small discrepancies, but it's basically taking those contours that you have right now and averaging out the terrain in between those contours. So this is going to give you the most accurate representation of breaking down your model into smaller contour lines.
So you're not like changing where the contour lines are, you're just making more.
Yeah. Because what Jeff had brought into this program was only those 1 meter contours, and you can't, without building this landscape, we can't really do anything. So that's essentially all we were doing, was just making sure that this terrain, because you guys couldn't really see it because it's so large, but that there is actually some change to it. So if we take this, just move that back. They have, well, Jeff's group has defined this kind of box as they're defining edge of their model. So if you just project that, on the terrain with just the command project, and then just trim the edge off, then they have the terrain exactly that fits what their model needs are. Again, this is kind of, it's not the best example to use right now, but obviously you need, right now we just have a flat surface for the terrain, but we need to make this a 3-dimensional model. That's essentially what you would see when you present it. So we need to give it a depth. I'm going to exaggerate the depth on this because it's actually hard to tell anything that's going on in this model.
I realized that this file that I gave you, the units are wrong.
Oh, okay.
There is some discrepancy within units, so it's like, it might be like, this is in millimeters, so when you go up 2, it's only 2 millimeters, where in actual fact, each contour should be 1,000.
Yeah.
So you maybe, yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
We won't blame Jeff for this, but it's not the right model. So basically all I'm going to do now is just extrude that box, or that boundary box that he was using. So if I just extrude that curve and make sure that up here that we have solid checked, because we just want a solid box of that. And I'm going to use both sides just so that we can see kind of where the box is starting and stopping. Okay, so now you guys can see that we have the terrain inside this solid box. We can then duplicate the border around the terrain that we have, and then use that line to trim the excess piece off of that model. So now we just need to join this all together into one. So see down at the bottom it says one closed poly surface. That you want to make sure that your terrain model is always in a closed poly surface, otherwise you have weird openings and things in your model, which further down the line when you do CNCs or 3D modeling, or 3D printing, it always needs to have those closed surfaces or closed poly surfaces. Right now it's not too important for the actual laser cutting, but you will need that later on. So now on his model, there was the roads right there. I'll just grab those. Oops. Okay, so if we move these roads again over to the rest of this model, some of his roads were wonky, and you want to make sure that these are all kind of closed up before you start, if you guys are adding rows or building footprints to your model. But what you would do, so just make sure these are all one piece before you start. So I'll just use this little selection of roads to actually project on here. So all we're going to do is just use that same project command and project it onto the model. Now, as you can see, when it is a solid form, it projects through the entire model. So we actually don't want that. So what we're going to do is just take this geometry apart again, just so that we can work with it for a second. So by extracting surface, you can just take the top piece off, the top geometry off, and then we're going to go back with this geometry and project it again so that it just projects onto the top surface. Now you can see that we have the roads actually on the flat surface. So if we do, oops, I'll just delete this so that we don't get confused. So we have these two geometries or these two curves of the roads, and we're just going to split. So the command split will take it apart. So we want to actually split the terrain, and we want to cut it with these roads. So now our surface is made up of all of these different pieces, which is what we wanted. But in order to get the actual geometries of this road, we're just going to move it down. And again, his model units are a little bit off, but I'm just going to move it down. I realize a road isn't 1 meter deep, but just to try and get some definition in it, we can see there. We can see that there's kind of that gap within the model. So now what you have to do if you want these roads is just join these two surfaces together with the extrude command. So you can take, if we just take this and duplicate the border, then we now have this edge that we want to extrude up that 1 meter. And then we can take all of these Sometimes, again, you have to fine-tune this a little bit with these geometries, but if you go in there and use that command for all of your roads and your housing footprints, then when you go back and let's just grab all this. Actually, sorry, one sec here. Okay, so sorry about that then. Yeah, okay. It's going to take a little bit to generate, but once it generates, then we'll be able to see the cutouts of the road. So it will actually generate the exact road cutouts on your file. If you don't want to do this, there's another way to do that if you don't actually want your roads to be cut out of your contours, but we'll go over that in a second.
After you split the terrain and cut it with the roads and then entered the depth that you wanted the roads to be, what was the next command after that? The one that you're doing right now was called?
Oh, I'm just doing the contours again, just to show you guys where the contours will now change with the terrain because you have the roads in it. This is the same one as before. You just type in contour.
And then it does that, or do you type in something else?
Well, you type in contour and then you just tell it which direction you want. You want it to go from top to bottom, bottom to top. It doesn't really matter. And then you change the variable to whichever contour distance you want. So 0.5 meter, meter, whichever. It actually didn't do it because these geometries aren't joined, so I only told it to do the large geometry, but that was because of me trying to speed through and connect the roads with the new terrain. But you can do that. It doesn't take very long. You just actually have to get in your model and make sure everything's properly done. So
all the surfaces need to be joined for this in order for the contour to work.
Yeah, you wanna just remember that you always have that closed poly surface. You can still do the contour like I just showed you, but it missed some of the parts because it wasn't actually a closed poly surface.
Mm-hmm.
Now for the actual files, if you guys want to, like the files that you're going to be making in Illustrator with these contours, there's two ways of doing it, which again I'll go over it tomorrow, but the second way I'm going to show you, which is pretty expedited, it doesn't allow you to actually have the road lines on your model. It's just going to fully just give you the contours and that's it. So if you want to go through and get these lines on it, you're going to have to do it some way else. So if you are planning on creating all your roads and everything with the laser cutter, then you're going to have to do that the more manual style, which is creating these contours and then moving them into an Illustrator file. But again, that's all stuff we'll go over with tomorrow. So this was, I guess, the basic version of how to create your terrain from contour lines. Now I'm going to go over another way to do it. It's a little less exact, but for the purposes of design, sometimes you don't necessarily need to know the exact terrain in spots. So for that one, we are just going to go to SketchUp, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and we want to add a location. So I'm going to just stick with the same location that we were using for Jeff's, which is Lake Bannock. So I just went up here to the little Google map, and it brought me to Google Maps where I searched it. This is his site right around here. So we can select the region by just dragging these. I'm not sure exactly what his site is, but something like that. And just grab that. It'll take a second to load. So now we have just a flat site model. If we go back up to File, Geolocation, and Show the Terrain, then it bumps up into a three-dimensional terrain that we can then export into Rhino. So if we go export 3D model, and you want to make sure that it is exporting as a 3ds file, and export that. Shouldn't take this long, but so when it's exporting this, it's exporting the terrain, but it's also exporting this JPEG image of the site as well, which will help you so that you can bring in your own GIS road lines or whatever other information you have from your CAD file or GIS.
So for our group, because we're on the water, we have a very defined edge, because there's like shore and there's water. And so when I was doing the models and stuff yesterday, I was finding that every time I recut the contours, the shoreline becomes very abstracted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And I
that
guess,
happens.
is there a way that we could extract the half-meter contours and then I just bring over that defined shoreline and then project it up and then use that as like at least something that we can just laser cut that piece instead of the one that it's creating?
Well, what I would probably do in that case is, because you're going to have a fairly, it's going to be a fairly close representation, but you just need that defined edge. So I would take that GIS file or that GIS AutoCAD contour that you have of the water's edge, and then just extrude it down into whatever it is, like 2 meters, 3 meters, so that you hit the water and cut through that, and then just join that whole model, like Boolean the entire model into one closed poly surface. That's probably going to be your best bet, so that you still have that kind of the flat, I'm guessing there's docks and things out there, but you'll have that flat dock that goes straight down into the water. Okay, so once we've exported this model, what the hell? Go back into Rhino. Did it export right? It may or may not have exported right. We'll see. Okay, and just keep it unwelded. For some reason, it likes to change the degree of the import. So this is the model that we brought in from Google. You can see a bit more terrain in this one.
But, okay, I just have a quick question about this model. I mean, this doesn't account for the bathymetry, right?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So we're losing out on all of the underwater topography, essentially, on this model. Google doesn't actually account for that. It just goes to the water level. So this may or may not work for some of you, depending if you have water on your site. But this is another option. And again, it's not as accurate as taking those contour lines and patching them into a surface. So we just want to place that background image so we know what we're working with. So, sorry, I'll do that again. If you just go to View, Background Bitmap, and then you can place the image underneath the file. And you can do this no matter what you're working with or whatever on Rhino, if you can just import a file from Google and scale it. Once you've actually placed this image, just snap it to the vertex. You can always rescale it. But there we go. So we see everything underneath. You can go in and hand draw your roads if you really want to. I wouldn't recommend it. But there it is. Unfortunately, it's on a mesh. It imports as a mesh. So you want to take that mesh and make it into a NURB surface. So if you just do the command drape, and then you're just going to take it over. It doesn't really matter at this point. Just make sure it covers the whole area. And again, just put ghosted on. So now you can see we have these two surfaces here. That's the one we've just created. And okay. There we go. And this is the old one. I'm just gonna move it out of the way here. Okay. So this is the topography we're now working with. Just to create more of a defined box, I'm just going to take a rectangle here. Obviously, you're going to need a little more precision based on the size of your model and the scale. But I'm going to do the same process and just project it onto the surface that I've just made and trim the excess. So now you see it's pretty much the exact same as we just ran with the patch on the last version of doing this. And just to show you guys again the difference, I'm going to run the contours. Oops. And 25 meter. Yeah, so this model again, it's zoomed out quite far, so only doing half-meter contours probably wasn't the best idea. So we're just gonna wait for this.
It's not bad.
Hmm?
It's not bad.
And then so for this one, all the exact, like you'll run through it the same way for the next commands for the roads and the houses, whichever you're putting on it. There is additionally, if any of you are really comfortable on Rhino, I don't have Grasshopper on my computer here, but I have a file or a Grasshopper, whatever those are called, thing that automatically brings your like if you build all of these houses in SketchUp or something, or even in Rhino that are just on a flat surface, it'll bring all of these houses or buildings down and rest them perfectly kind of on your new terrain, depending, obviously, like if you have a super steep site, it'll place it perfectly on your terrain. But you guys can come and separately get that file from me if you want. Okay, it's almost done here. Okay, so when we zoom into this one, we can tell the precision of it is a bit off. It's getting the gist of it, but things in, say, in this area, this was a problem that Jeff and I were having yesterday, was because he was trying to build his contours with his road on it, which you really shouldn't do. It then thinks that there's a buildup all the way across this little lake, but there's actually, you can go underneath it, right? It's, yeah. So it's open for boats to go underneath this road. So things like that you have to be careful with. And again, this, you can see that it's not the greatest precision for that. But if you guys aren't really working with or need a really precise topography, you can do it this way. Yeah, I ran through that pretty quick, but those are the two methods of building your landscape. Any questions?
What's the, so if you've got all of this stuff, what's going to be the final format for the laser cutter itself? Are you going to flatten all of these lines and then export them as a...
Okay, so tomorrow when I go through all this, I'm going to do two different methods. What I want you guys to have, ideally for tomorrow if you can, is to have your site model built up as it's going to be set on the table. So however high you guys are going to put your base, whichever, just have that all set in 3 dimensions. And then from that, as a closed poly surface, and then from that, we're going to do 2 different ways tomorrow of just either cutting contours like this and then taking those curves and putting them in Illustrator. Or there's another program that will just take that closed poly surface. You just put that closed poly surface into the program, and it spits out all of your separate pieces on Illustrator files that you can just pump into Illustrator. So you don't have to deal with placing all of these contours on separate sheets. It'll do it all for you. So it's just best to come to the class with your closed poly surface model kind of thing, and then we'll go from there and make your files.
How do you check that it's a closed poly surface?
So if you're on the Mac side, it just shows up on the properties panel on your right hand side. So just always have properties open. On this one, yeah, it says open surface right there, object type. So they're different on each platform, but just go into properties on Windows, or yeah, I guess this is the property one on Mac. And it will also say it at the bottom here on the left-hand corner. It will say, obviously, your last command, but it'll also say if that was a successful command into a closed poly surface, or if it's still an open poly surface. And then another way to check is the command, like if you end up having an open poly surface and you don't know why, the command show edges, and so if you do that and then choose naked edges and zoom there, so it will show that, yes, obviously I know that all of this around, because it's an open poly surface, is where the holes in my project are. But yeah, if you just run that command, if you run into any problems, you'll be able to fix it pretty easy. Mallory?
Have they made the grasshopper plugin for Mac yet?
Apparently they have. I tried getting it on here, but it wasn't working. So I don't know if it's my computer or what.
I
But
wouldn't really recommend downloading things that are work in progress, because sometimes they put demands on your computer hardware and it could really screw it up. I wouldn't risk it. I would just use school computers if you don't have Windows. Yeah.
You say that the thickness of the base needs to be accounted for?
yeah, I mean, depending how high you're going to build it up, obviously if you're if your lowest level, if you're only going to put like one sheet underneath and the contours just run into that, really just account for how tall your model is. But some people are going to make a larger base, and then that can actually be accounted for in the program we'll use tomorrow.
So this model that we are doing is 2 laser beds put together.
Mm-hmm.
So that is essentially too big to fit on the laser cutter. So when you take it into 123D Make, can you specify a boundary in there that will like?
It will
cut that in
automatically,
half?
if your model that you're bringing in is 32 by 36, then it will automatically, it knows the bed size is 32 by 18, so it's going to choose the most efficient way to do it. So it will essentially cut it right in half. Good.
No more questions?
All right. Well, come to either Kat or myself if you guys run into any problems. I don't know what side I'm on, but someone does.
You're like kitty
I'm over there.
corners.
Yeah.